At my granddaughter's wedding, they handed me a name tag that read, "The Absent Old Lady." I wore it without protest, then left before the cake was cut and before the final bill was paid. As the limousine doors closed around me, I watched the ballroom lights fade into the distance, carrying with them decades of sacrifice, silence, and slow erasure. They thought I was invisible, forgotten, irrelevant, but when they opened the invoice, they'd see exactly who had been watching all along. You here follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has. The elegant notes of Pachelbel's canon drifted softly through the air as I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Bellamy Hotel. I had spent 3 painstaking hours getting ready for Elsie's wedding, my granddaughter, my only granddaughter. Each pearl button on my pale blue dress fought my stiff, arthritic fingers, but I persisted, having saved for months from my meager Social Security checks just to buy that dress. "You'll look beautiful, Eleanor," I whispered to myself that morning, carefully applying lipstick and twisting my silver hair into a tidy bun. At 70, I still took pride in presenting myself well, especially for family occasions. My heart fluttered with cautious hope. It had been months since I'd had more than a passing conversation with anyone in my family, but maybe, just maybe, today could be different. Maybe today I would feel like I belonged again. The invitation had come 6 weeks earlier, formal and distant, like it had been written by a stranger. Still, I RSVP'd right away, clinging to the chance that it could be a step toward closing the ever-widening gap between us. At the entrance, a young woman with a painfully tight ponytail and a matching smile greeted me. She barely looked up from her tablet. "Name?" she asked. "Eleanor Walsh," I replied with a note of pride. "I'm the bride's grandmother." Her fingers flicked across the screen. "Right." She pushed a name tag across the counter toward me. I reached for it, expecting to see something elegant, maybe even affectionate. Instead, in rushed handwriting, it read, "The Absent Old Lady." For a moment, I just stared. My fingers trembled as I held it. This had to be a mistake. Surely someone had written the wrong thing. "Excuse me," I said, my throat dry. "I think there's an error with my badge." "We're quite busy, ma'am," she said flatly, already motioning to the next guest. "The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. Please find your seat." I clutched the tag, its weight somehow heavier than my entire purse. Across the room, I saw her. Elsie, glowing in her lace-covered designer gown, surrounded by bridesmaids. She laughed easily, head tilted back, carefree. Beside her stood my son, James, his arms snug around his wife Diane's waist. He looked proud, composed. Then there was Franklin, the groom, tall, polished, and cold. I'd met him twice. He'd barely looked at me either time. I pinned the badge to my dress, each push of the pin like surrendering a little more of myself. No one would notice anyway. No one had, not for years. An usher, a young man who avoided my eyes, led me to my seat, tucked behind a towering floral arrangement in the far back corner. I sat down slowly, smoothed the folds of my dress, and held on to my beaded purse. Inside, it was a check it had written after 3 months of careful budgeting. A modest gift, but full of love. "Is this seat taken?" a voice asked. I looked up to see an elderly man pointing to the empty chair beside me. "No, please," I said, grateful not to be completely invisible. "Herbert Miller," he said warmly, "friend of the family." "Eleanor Walsh," I replied. "I'm Elsie's grandmother." His brows lifted in disbelief. "The bride's grandmother sitting way back here?" I gave him the smile I'd used for decades, one that politely disguised pain. "It's fine," I lied. But it wasn't. I strained to see the ceremony through the flowers. When Elsie and Franklin exchanged vows, I caught only occasional glimpses. When everyone rose to cheer for the new couple, I stood too, blinking away a tear, not of joy, but of something more like quiet grief. The reception only deepened the ache. My place card directed me to table 19, the furthest from the head table. It was labeled Extended Connections. Around me sat vague acquaintances and people I didn't recognize. I watched James raise his glass to toast his daughter, spinning stories from her childhood. Stories I had lived through, memories I had helped shape. He spoke of bedtime stories, of scraped knees and school projects. But not once did he mention me. Not the years I'd raised her after his divorce, when he was too busy rebuilding his life to care for a heartbroken teenager. When dinner ended, I took a deep breath and approached the bridal table, envelope in hand. Elsie caught sight of me and leaned in to whisper something to Franklin. They both turned away before I even reached them. "Elsie, darling," I said gently, stepping forward, "you look absolutely beautiful." She turned, her smile thin. "Oh, Grandma, you made it." "Of course," I said breathlessly. "I wouldn't miss your special day." I held out the envelope. "A small gift." "You can leave it with the others," she interrupted, gesturing toward a lavish table stacked with presents. "We're about to start the dance." She turned before I could kiss her cheek. I quietly placed my envelope among the pile and turned to walk away. That's when I saw it, abandoned on a nearby chair, and was the wedding planner's clipboard. A checklist sat in plain sight. Under special arrangements, one note stood out in stark black ink. Eleanor Walsh. Isolated seating, minimal interaction as requested by bride's mother. The air around me shifted. For years, I'd told myself they were just busy, just preoccupied. I'd made excuses for the missed calls, the late replies, the forgotten birthdays. But this was planned. This was deliberate. A wound opened inside me, one I hadn't let myself feel fully in years. I stepped away, found a quiet corner near the coat check, and stood still, as if the world itself had stopped spinning. 1,000 memories swept over me. How I had rushed to the hospital the day Elsie was born, cradling a handmade blanket I had knit for months. How she'd spent summers at my home while James and Diane worked on their marriage, drawing pictures at my kitchen table as I baked her favorite chocolate chip cookies. And now this. And still, there was more to come. The early years had been a treasure trove of moments, sweet and fleeting, like warm cookies out of the oven. I'd been there for every milestone. I taught Elsie to read, to dig her fingers into the soil and coax life from it, to sit still and let classical music sweep over her like waves. I saw the spark of her creativity before anyone else did and bought her first set of watercolors. She'd cried on my shoulder when she won her first school art competition at the age of 10, tears of joy. That shoulder had always been there for her. But everything shifted when James divorced Diane and married Sandra 3 years later. Sandra came from old money, the kind that whispered its presence through polished mahogany floors and family heirlooms rather than shouting it. Suddenly, my home, with its faded curtains and mismatched furniture, was too humble. My presence, once warm and central, became an awkward afterthought. Elsie's visits shrank, like fabric left too long in hot water. First shorter, then fewer, until they stopped entirely except for the obligatory appearances during the holidays. I sold my house when I turned 65, the home where I'd raised James on my own after Henry died suddenly of a heart attack at just 42. James had been 13, still a boy, and I took on 2 jobs to make sure he got to college. That house had been more than a shelter. It had been a scrapbook of our life. I sold it because James said he needed help with Elsie's tuition. "It's an investment in her future, Mom," he said. "This opportunity could change her life." I didn't even hesitate. I handed over every penny, $175,000 from the sale, because I would have done anything for that child. I moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. It was noisy, cramped, and smelled faintly of exhaust from the nearby highway, but I told myself it was cozy. I told myself the noise was a kind of urban rhythm, a city's heartbeat, not an annoyance. James promised they'd visit every Sunday. That promise lived 3 weeks before it quietly died. Then it became once a month, then just holidays, and finally only Christmas. Even that was stripped down to a perfunctory 2-hour drop-by, where they showed up late and left early. They left with the carefully chosen gifts I'd spent months picking out, though I never saw Elsie wear or use any of them. She never asked about them either. And now, standing alone in a corner of the wedding ballroom, invisible behind a flower arrangement, I watched the family I had sacrificed everything for celebrate, without me. That's when it hit me with the finality of a slammed door. I had been erased. "Mrs. Walsh?" A soft voice broke through my thoughts. I turned and saw an older gentleman in a chauffeur's uniform. He introduced himself as George Miller. "I used to drive for the Hendersons next door to you years ago." George, I said, smiling with a flicker of genuine warmth. A familiar face in a sea of strangers. What a small world. He explained that he now worked for Elite Limousine Service, and tonight he was assigned to the wedding party. He studied me with gentle concern. Are you all right, Mrs. Walsh? You seem troubled. Something in his kindness unraveled the tight stitches I'd sewn around my emotions. Oh, George, I whispered, I don't think I belong here. I showed him my name tag. His face darkened with quiet outrage. That's disgraceful, he said. It's been like this for years, I admitted. I just didn't want to see it. George looked at his watch. My shift runs till midnight, but I'm not scheduled for any pickups for a few hours. Would you like a ride home, White? No charge, of course. I hesitated, my gaze drifting back toward the reception where guests were gathering for the cake cutting. Another family moment I'd observed from the shadows. I thought of my quiet apartment, and surprisingly, the words came out steady. They won't even notice I'm gone. George offered his arm. My car's right outside, Mrs. Walsh. As we walked through the grand hotel lobby, I passed the wedding planner deep in conversation with the hotel manager. They were reviewing some paperwork, and I overheard fragments. Final payment due tonight, bride's parents' credit card on file, balance of $42,075. I paused and a thought stirred. Just a ripple, small and quiet but persistent. In the soft leather interior of the limousine, with the city lights flickering outside, I turned to George. Do you happen to know who's paying for the wedding? The bride's parents arranged it all through Elite, he replied. Mr. James Walsh paid the deposits, but the final contract lists both him and the bride as financially responsible. I nodded slowly. I remembered overhearing a conversation between James and Sandra at Thanksgiving. Mom's house money covered most of Elsie's tuition, but we had to tap into our savings for the wedding. Thank God for those zero-interest credit cards. George, I said carefully, how well do you know the Bellamy's management? Fairly well, Mrs. Walsh. I've been driving their VIPs for 7 years now. If I wanted to make a change to the payment arrangements for tonight's event, who would I talk to? He met my eyes in the rearview mirror. Are you thinking what I think you're thinking? For the first time that evening, I smiled, a real one, not the polite, practiced curve I'd worn like armor. I'm not sure yet, I said. But I believe I've been absent long enough, don't you? The next morning, my phone rang persistently. I let it go to voicemail. James's voice filled the room, taut with restrained fury. Mom, what the hell did you do? The hotel says the final payment was canceled and rearranged. They're charging us the full amount. Call me back immediately. I sipped my tea slowly, watching the sunlight stream through my curtains. Another call. Sandra's voice now, sharp and shrill. After George dropped me off the night before, I'd asked him to take me to the hotel's billing office. The night manager had been skeptical at first, but after I showed him my ID and explained my request, he softened. I told him I wanted to remove the complimentary grandmother contribution from the wedding charges. Family disagreement? He asked gently. Family clarification, I corrected. My phone rang again, Elsie's voice this time, tearful. Franklin's parents are horrified. Our honeymoon might have to be canceled. How could you do this to me on my special day? I thought of my name tag, my seat hidden behind the floral arrangements, the barely there interactions. I thought of my house, of the money, of all the Sundays I'd spent waiting for a knock on the door that never came. I picked up my teacup, took another sip, and began to map out the next chapter of my life, a chapter where I was no longer invisible, one where I finally mattered, to myself. The next 3 days were a storm of voicemail messages, each more frantic than the last. I listened to them all with the calm detachment of someone tuning into a foreign broadcast. Mom, we need to talk about this right now, James said, his voice no longer commanding, but cracking at the edges, thinning into something that almost resembled fear. Panic. That was the first word Sandra chose in her message, followed by an urgent plea. Ella Leonard, please be reasonable. Her trademark condescension bled through, though she couldn't quite hide her unease. This is becoming embarrassing for everyone. By the fourth day, the tone had shifted. This time it was Elsie, tearful, but with a hint of calculation. Grandma, we're having to cancel our honeymoon to Bali. Is that what you wanted? To ruin my special time with Franklin? I sat at my modest kitchen table, tracing my fingertip along the rim of a chipped teacup. Morning light poured through the window, casting golden rays that caught in the drifting dust, making them shimmer like tiny ghosts. Outside, the garbage truck rumbled down the street, its steady beep, 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 an oddly comforting soundtrack to the silence in my head. I hadn't anticipated this emptiness. Movies always paint revenge as sweet, thrilling, some triumphant catharsis. But all I felt was a hollow ache, tempered by a fragile flicker of resolve. The doorbell jolted me from my thoughts. I peered through the peephole and saw James shifting his weight impatiently, his expensive watch glinting as he checked the time. Sandra stood stiffly beside him, arms folded tightly, her face a mask of practiced displeasure. For a moment I considered not answering. But old habits, especially maternal ones, die hard. I'd never been able to turn my son away, even after years of neglect. "Mom," James started the moment I opened the door. No greeting, no preamble. "This has gone far enough. You need to fix this." I stepped aside wordlessly, letting them in. Their eyes darted around my tiny apartment, taking in the worn furnishings with barely concealed disdain. "Would you like some tea?" I offered out of habit, more than warmth. "We don't have time for tea," Sandra snapped. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I lowered myself into my usual armchair and gestured toward the sofa. James didn't sit. He stayed standing, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. "I simply clarified the financial arrangements," I replied, my voice calm. As the grandmother of the bride, I was expected to contribute. But as the invisible grandmother, I thought it only fitting that my contribution be invisible too. James's face flushed red. "What are you even talking about?" I walked to the sideboard and retrieved my purse, untouched since the wedding night. From it, I pulled out a small name tag and placed it on the coffee table. Sandra's eyes flickered in recognition before she quickly looked away. James picked it up, confusion twisting his brow. "This must have been a mistake," he muttered, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Was it also a mistake to seat me behind the floral arrangements?" I asked quietly. "A mistake that the wedding planner's note specifically instructed minimal interaction with me?" Sandra cast a sharp look toward James, some unspoken warning passing between them. "We didn't," James began, but I cut him off. "Please don't lie to me." My voice was soft but steady. "I've had enough lies. Enough broken promises about Sunday visits that never came. Enough assurances that the money from selling my home was going toward Elsie's education, that it was an investment in her future." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. "Mom," James said at last, shifting into his practiced, professional tone, the one he used with clients he wanted to pacify. "I understand you're upset, but your reaction is completely disproportionate. The hotel is demanding $42,000 immediately. We don't have that kind of liquid cash right now." "I sold my house for $175,000, I reminded him. "Every penny of it went to Elsie's tuition, because you said it would secure her future. So where did the rest of the money go, James?" He shifted, the discomfort obvious now. "That's not really relevant." "It's entirely relevant," I shot back. "That money was for my retirement. Instead, I'm here." I gestured around the apartment, at the water stains spreading like a bruise across the ceiling, at the old radiator that clanked all through winter. "Meanwhile, you and Sandra live in a 5-bedroom home in Oakwood Hills. Elsie wears designer clothes and vacations in Europe." Sandra stood abruptly. "We didn't come here to be interrogated about our finances. We're here to deal with the hotel situation." I turned to face her directly for the first time. I saw her clearly, this woman who had slowly, deliberately cut me out of my own family's life. "The hotel situation is already resolved," I said. "According to the contract, the responsible parties will pay in full." "We can't afford this right now," James exploded. "The business is going through a transition, and we just made the down payment on Elsie and Franklin's condo, and—" He stopped mid-sentence, realizing too late what he'd revealed. "You bought them a condo?" I asked, my voice low, the final puzzle piece sliding into place. "That's where my house money went?" His silence was all the confirmation I needed. "Get out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. James blinked in disbelief. Mom, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious. I stood slowly. My knees protested, but I ignored them. Get out of my home. Sandra hesitated only a moment. This isn't over, she warned as I opened the door. You're right, I replied. It's just beginning. After they left, I remained in my chair, trembling from head to toe. Standing up to them had taken more strength than they would ever know. For years, I had accepted crumbs, little scraps of attention, vague gestures of affection, and told myself it was enough. I was so afraid of losing even those crumbs that I made myself small, silent, grateful for their neglect. But not anymore. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and there would be no going back. There would be fallout, retaliation. I was afraid, terrified in truth, but beneath the fear burned a small, steady flame of something stronger. Resolve. Then the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID. It was a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Walsh, this is Walter Drummond from First Capital Bank. I'm calling about your safety deposit box. There's a bit of confusion I was hoping to clear up. My stomach turned cold. What kind of confusion? Your son, James, came in this morning with a power of attorney document and asked for access to your box. The paperwork looked questionable, so I declined and wanted to confirm with you directly. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from swaying. I never signed a power of attorney. That's what concerned me, Walter replied gently. Would you be able to come in today to review it? An hour later, I sat in Walter's office, staring at a piece of paper that bore a signature eerily similar to mine. But not mine. Not the sharp swoop of the W, not the loop I always made in the H. It was a skillful forgery, but it wasn't mine. This is forged, I said quietly, amazed at how steady my voice sounded while my heart shook with fury and betrayal. I never signed this. Walter nodded solemnly. That's what I suspected. Mrs. Walsh, I suggest you take immediate steps to protect your assets. If they've attempted this, there may be other areas we need to secure. I remembered Henry's modest inheritance, tucked safely away in that deposit box. The municipal bonds, the little collection of jewelry more precious in memory than in money, my mother's pearl necklace, and Henry's old pocket watch. Each item small but carrying weight. I glanced at Walter and asked, what do you suggest? Before he could answer, his office phone rang. He picked up, listened silently for a moment, then placed his hand over the receiver. It's your son. He's downstairs, asking to speak with me. Quite insistent. Something inside me shifted, deep and irreversible. A quiet but unmistakable break. Tell him I'm here, I said. It's time we had an honest conversation. When James entered Walter Drummond's office and saw me seated there, his confident stride faltered. His expression faltered too. Shock, confusion, something close to dread. Mom, he said, the word tight in his throat. I've been trying to find you. Have you? I replied with careful calm. Or have you been looking for a way into my safety deposit box? Walter rose, tall and commanding even in his age. Mr. Walsh, he said firmly, I've reviewed the document you brought, and there are significant irregularities. Your mother has just confirmed she never signed anything of the sort. James's eyes flitted from Walter to me and back again, his brain visibly working, calculating angles and escape routes. I recognized the look. It was the same expression he wore when he broke my favorite vase at 7, when he stole the car keys at 16, when he pleaded for funding for his first business at 24. There's obviously been a misunderstanding, he said, his tone suddenly smooth and reasonable. Mom, remember? We talked about this after your fall a few months back? I never fell, I said plainly. Not once. He pushed ahead anyway, voice gentle, words fabricated. You were worried about managing things on your own as you got older. You said it might be easier if I could help take care of a few things. Walter's tone sharpened. Mr. Walsh, forging a power of attorney is not just unethical, it's a felony. For the first time, James's polished mask slipped. A flicker of panic crossed his face. I would never... This is ridiculous. Mom, tell him there's been a mistake. And then I really looked at him. The suit tailored to his widening waistline. The hair trimmed just so, subtly hiding the early signs of a retreating hairline. The manicured hands, the overpriced watch. When did my son become this man? This stranger who would stoop so low for access to my small savings? The only mistake, I said softly, was thinking you still had any respect for me. His cheeks colored. That's not fair. I've always what? I cut him off. Always remembered my birthday? Always included me in family holidays? Always been honest about what you did with the money from my house? The silence that followed was brutal. Walter cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Walsh, would you like me to call security? I shook my head. No, but I do want to make some changes to my accounts. James stepped forward. Mom, you're overreacting. Let's just talk about this at home. My home? I asked pointedly. You mean the tiny apartment I moved into after selling my house to help Elsie? The one that was supposed to pay for her future but somehow ended up funding a condo for her in Franklin instead? Walter's voice cut in, calm but firm. Mr. Walsh, I'll need to speak with your mother alone now. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. She's confused, James insisted. She's getting older. Sometimes she doesn't. I'm 70, I snapped. Not senile. And I have never been clearer about anything in my life. Leave now, James, or Mr. Drummond will call security. He paused, jaw tight, then adjusted his jacket and turned toward the door. This isn't over, he said, words that echoed what Sandra had told me not long ago. No, I said evenly. It isn't. Once he was gone, Walter looked at me with real concern. Mrs. Walsh, I strongly advise we move quickly to secure your finances. And for the next hour, that's exactly what we did. We revoked every permission, changed passwords and recovery questions, reconfigured every bit of access he might have had. Walter even referred me to a small local law firm that specialized in elder care protection. It might be wise to consult with them, he said. Given this attempted forgery, there could be other vulnerabilities we haven't uncovered yet. I nodded, grateful but drained. Thank you, Walter. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't called me. His face softened, his eyes kind behind his glasses. In 43 years as a banker, I've seen the very best and the very worst of families. Unfortunately, money often brings out the worst. As I gathered my purse, he hesitated. Mrs. Walsh, Eleanor, may I ask what you plan to do now? I considered the question. I'm not completely sure, I admitted, but for the first time in a long while, whatever I do will be my decision. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk, a little dizzy from the flood of cars and footsteps, the rush of possibility. For years, my world had shrunk down to this tiny apartment, to brief, awkward family get-togethers where I was more tolerated than embraced. Now, suddenly, I was free. Free from pretending. Free from hoping they'd see me. Really see me. But freedom, I realized, could also be terrifying. My phone rang, Sandra again. I hit silence without hesitation. Then I pulled up a number I hadn't dialed in months. Hello, came the voice on the other end, warm, familiar. Helen? I said, my voice catching just slightly. It's Eleanor. I was wondering, is that offer to visit still open? Helen had been my closest friend for 40 years until she moved to Maine 5 years ago to be near her daughter. She'd invited me so many times to come visit, and every time I declined, afraid James or Elsie might need me, might resent my absence. Eleanor, she cried. Of course it's still open. I've been saving your bedroom all this time. When can you come? For the first time in days, maybe even years, I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes. How about next week, I asked. Later that night, I started packing a small suitcase for the trip, and just as I zipped the last corner, the doorbell rang. It was Elsie standing in the hallway. Her eyes were rimmed red. Her face wore that familiar blend of practiced sadness and offended pride. Grandma, she began, her voice shaking ever so slightly. We need to talk. I opened the door and led her inside. At least she had the grace to hug me, a half-hearted gesture, but more than either of her parents had offered. Would you like some tea? I asked. She shook her head. I can't stay long. She took a breath, steadying herself. Grandma, Franklin and I had to cancel our honeymoon because of what happened with the hotel bill. Dad says you're refusing to help. I looked at my granddaughter carefully, studying her face, the same face I'd watched grow up through the years. She was so beautiful, a young woman now, yet I couldn't help but see the little girl who once sat at my kitchen table. coloring in picture books and telling me about the life she dreamed of having. But now, when had that bright-eyed little girl turned into someone who sounded so entitled? When had gratitude been quietly replaced with expectation? Elsie, I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady, do you remember the name tag you made for me at the wedding? She frowned, her expression uncertain. What name tag? The one that said the absent old lady, I reminded her gently. The one that made sure I knew exactly what you all think of me. A flush crept into her cheeks. I didn't. That wasn't. Please don't lie to me, I cut her off quietly. I saw the wedding planner's notes about minimal interaction. As requested by your mother, I know I was deliberately sidelined. Elsie sank heavily onto my sofa, her designer purse sliding unceremoniously to the floor. Grandma, you don't understand. Sandra thought, I understand perfectly, I said firmly, my voice even. And I've made my decision. The wedding costs are your responsibility, just as it's outlined in the contract your father signed it. The honeymoon, however, I paused, looking her in the eye. That's a luxury, not a necessity. She opened her mouth, stunned, but I continued. Perhaps you can use the down payment from that condo your parents bought you. Her eyes widened in shock. How did you know about that? I just found out today, I said, my tone flat. Apparently that's where the money from my house went, the house I sold to pay for your education. For a moment, Elsie's face crumpled, and I thought I saw genuine shame flicker there, but it passed too quickly. Dad said that was an investment we all agreed on. An investment, I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Yes, that's exactly how he described it to me as well. Funny how differently we seem to interpret that word. I let out a long, tired sigh. Suddenly, the weight of the entire conversation, the years of pretense, of being useful but never truly wanted, pressed down on me. Elsie, I said at last, I'm going away for a while. I need some time to think about what happens next. Going away? She echoed, her eyes darting to the half-packed suitcase by the door. Where? For how long? I'm not sure yet, I admitted honestly. But I've spent years making myself available to a family that only reached out when it was convenient. It's time I live for myself for a change. Her expression hardened, her voice carrying the same sharpness that reminded me painfully of Sandra. So you're abandoning us when we need you most? The irony of her words was so staggering, I almost laughed. Instead, I turned and walked to my bookshelf, pulling down a photo album worn soft from years of use. I opened it to a page I knew by heart and held it out to her. This, I said, pointing at the first picture, is you at 6 years old, staying with me the summer your parents were separating. A small gap-toothed Elsie smiled up from the photo, clutching a paintbrush. And this one, I flipped the page, is you at 12, Christmas morning. Your father was too busy with his new girlfriend to pick you up, so you were here with me. Another page. This is your high school graduation. See? I'm in the back row because Sandra said there wasn't enough room for me in the family section. I closed the album gently and took it back from her trembling hands. I have never abandoned you, Elsie. Not once in 23 years. I cannot say the same for any of you. The next morning, I boarded the early train to Portland. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks echoed the steady beating of my heart as I stared out the window. Towns and wide fields rolled past, each mile widening the distance between me and a family who had treated me as an afterthought for years. I had left before dawn, leaving no forwarding address, no explanatory note. For once, I wanted them to feel what I had felt so many times. The hollow emptiness of reaching out for someone who simply wasn't there. My phone had been buzzing relentlessly since Elsie's visit, but I'd silenced it. Occasionally, I glanced at the screen, missed calls from James, from Sandra, from Elsie, even from Franklin, no doubt pushed into it by his new wife. I pictured them all gathered around a phone, plotting how to reach me, how to regain control over me. I turned the phone off completely and slipped it into my purse. Helen was waiting at the Portland station when I arrived. Her silver hair shone in the late morning sunlight, and the moment I stepped onto the platform, her arms were around me. We hugged fiercely, tears and laughter spilling together. Let me look at you, she said, holding me at arm's length. Still elegant as ever, but thinner. Have you been eating properly? I laughed softly. Always the mother hen. Someone has to be, she teased gently, looping her arm through mine as we walked toward her car. Her cottage was perched on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, its white clapboard walls and blue shutters framed by a garden overflowing with late summer blooms. The endless blue horizon stretched out beyond the weathered deck. It's beautiful, I breathed as we carried my suitcase inside. It's peaceful, Helen corrected, setting a kettle on the stove, and exactly what you need right now. Over tea and warm, crumbly scones she'd baked that morning, I told her everything. The wedding, the cruel name tag, the forged power of attorney, the confrontations. Helen didn't interrupt once. She simply listened, her expression shifting from shock to outrage to a deep, aching sorrow. "Oh, Eleanor," she whispered when I finished. "I've always thought James was far too influenced by that woman. But this is beyond the pale." "I enabled it," I admitted quietly. "For years, I made excuses for them. I told myself they were busy, that family dynamics change as children grow older. I convinced myself that being occasionally remembered was better than being completely forgotten." Helen reached across the table, wrapping my hand in hers. "What will you do now?" I turned my gaze to the window, watching seagulls wheel against the endless, clear blue sky. "I'm not sure," I said truthfully. "For the first time in decades, I'm making decisions just for me. It's terrifying and exhilarating all at once." That evening, we sat side by side on her deck, watching as the sun melted into the ocean, streaking the sky in breathtaking shades of pink and gold. The steady crash of waves against the rocks below was soothing, like a balm on an open wound. "I've been thinking," Helen said at last, breaking the soft, comfortable silence. "My neighbor Irene runs the local arts center. They're looking for someone to teach beginner watercolor classes a few afternoons a week. It's nothing fancy, mostly retirees and summer visitors, but—" "I haven't painted in years," I interrupted, almost apologetically. "But you were good, Eleanor," Helen reminded me warmly. "Remember that summer in Provence after Henry died? Your landscapes, they captured something special, a quality of light, a sense of peace." A small smile tugged at my lips at the memory. After Henry's sudden death, when grief had nearly consumed me, Helen had convinced me to join her on a painting retreat in southern France. For 2 weeks in Marseille, we had once sat together beneath wide skies in fields scented with lavender, or tucked into quiet corners of village squares, sketching and painting, hoping to catch even a sliver of the beauty that surrounded Marseille. Back then, it wasn't just a pastime. It was my tether to life, something to cling to when everything else had crumbled. "I'm not sure I remember how to do it anymore," I admitted quietly. Helen laughed, that same easy, knowing laugh of hers. "It's like riding a bicycle," she said, brushing away my doubt. "Besides, the job pays. Not much, but enough to help out with your Social Security. And you could stay here for as long as you want, rent-free." "Helen, I couldn't possibly impose like that." "It's not an imposition," she replied, her voice firm with affection. "This house is too big for just me. The guest room sits empty most of the year, except for when my daughter drops by at Christmas." She looked at me, eyes softening. "And honestly, I've missed you. Missed having my best friend around." The prick of tears came fast, unexpected. "You mean it?" I asked. "With my whole heart," she said with a hesitation. "Stay a week, stay a month. If it suits you, stay longer. No pressure, no expectations." Those last words felt like a blessing, washing over me with quiet grace. 2 days later, I received an email from Walter Drummond at the bank. It was brief but unsettling. James had returned, this time dragging Sandra along, claiming there had been some kind of confusion about the power of attorney. When Walter informed them that I had left town with no indication of return, they pressed him to reveal my location. Naturally, he refused. "I wanted to let you know," Walter wrote in closing, "that they seemed determined to track you down. Mr. Walsh mentioned something about a family emergency requiring your immediate attention." I scoffed under my breath. Family emergency? I could only imagine. Most likely a hotel bill, or perhaps another one of James's ever-growing financial crises. That afternoon, I agreed to meet Irene at the local arts center. The place had once been a boathouse. now transformed into a light-filled studio perched right at the harbor's edge. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, catching the movement of waves and gulls in motion. Helen speaks very highly of your work, Irene said as she led me around the open space. We've had a surge of interest in beginner classes, but our current instructor is stretched too thin. I've never taught before, I admitted, feeling a flutter of doubt. I'm not sure I'd be any good at it. Irene was a brisk woman in her 60s, hair cropped short and silver, her jeans splattered with paint. She waved away my concern. Do you love painting? Yes, I said without a moment's hesitation. Can you explain to someone how to mix colors, how to hold a brush, how to see the world not as objects, but as light and form? I thought back to the quiet afternoons I'd spent teaching Elsie to paint, her tiny fingers curled around the brush as I guided her strokes. She had been so eager to learn, flowers, trees, little houses with windows. Yes, I said again, I can do that. Then you can teach, Irene declared. Start next Tuesday with the morning group. Mostly retirees, kind forgiving folks, perfect for a new instructor. As we wrapped up the details, my phone began to ring. I had only just turned it back on. Elsie's name lit up the screen. Excuse me, I said, stepping outside. I answered. Hello, Elsie. Grandma, she blurted, her voice tight and strained. Where are you? We've been worried sick. I told you I was visiting a friend, I replied calmly. Dad says you emptied your accounts and just disappeared, she snapped. He thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. A dry laugh escaped me, lost on the sea breeze. I'm not having a breakdown, Elsie. I'm finally learning to put myself first. But what about the family? What about the hotel bill? Or is there some new financial emergency I'm expected to fix? I finished for her, tone even but edged with knowing. The silence on the other end was answer enough. Elsie, I said softly, do you remember when I taught you to paint? You were 6 years old. What does that have to do with anything? She asked, frustration thick in her voice. Everything, I said. I just accepted a job teaching watercolor at an art center. I'll be staying here for a while. And where is here? She demanded. I looked out toward the harbor. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting golden paths across the water. Gulls wheeled above, and boats swayed gently in the tide. For the first time in years, I felt something like peace. Somewhere I'm respected, I answered. Somewhere I belong. Autumn had come to coastal Maine like a master painter's hand, turning every leaf into a vivid blaze of crimson, amber, and gold. It had been 3 months since I left, 3 months of tranquil mornings spent watching sunlight rise over the Atlantic. 3 months of teaching wide-eyed students to see the world through watercolor. 3 months of sitting with Helen on the back deck in the evenings, sipping wine beneath stars, sharing quiet laughter and decades of memories. The modest salary from the art center was enough to cover my expenses. I had moved my savings to a new local bank, with Walter's help, and now had full control over everything. James would never be able to touch a cent again. Over time, the calls from my family slowed. James left a trail of voicemails that grew shorter and sharper with every message, frustration bleeding through each clipped word. Sandra tried another approach, leaving syrupy messages about how everyone missed me, especially Elsie, who was lost without her grandmother's wisdom. Only Elsie's calls held any real weight, but even those carried undertones of guilt and desperation. I answered some, but always briefly, carefully avoiding talk of my location. Every conversation ended the same, a plea to come to my senses and return home, to help cover lingering wedding costs. Then came a Tuesday morning in late October. Helen stepped into the kitchen with a strange look on her face. Wordlessly, she handed me the local paper. You might want to see this, she said quietly. In the real estate section, a small ad stood out. Historic Maine cottage for sale. Ideal for vacations or retirement. Lovingly maintained for generations. This charming seaside residence boasts original features and breathtaking ocean views. Contact Walsh Properties for details. Beneath the text was a photograph. My parents' old summer cottage. The one they had left to me. The one I'd looked after all these years, even though I rarely had the chance to visit. The one I had almost forgotten was mine. My hands trembled as I lowered the paper. This isn't possible, and it whispered. I never authorized anything. That property is in my name, mine alone. Helen met my gaze with steady concern. The listing, she asked. Walsh Properties, I said, reading the fine print aloud. James's company. Without a moment's delay, I called my old bank in the city. Walter wasn't available just then, but his assistant promised he'd get back to me immediately. Then I dialed the county clerk's office to check the local records. The small county office where the cottage records were kept felt oddly impersonal, like an indifferent gatekeeper to something deeply personal. I calmly explained to the clerk that I needed to verify the ownership status of a particular property, providing the address. A few minutes passed in silence, filled only with the faint hum of machinery, before the clerk returned, his expression unreadable. There's been a transfer, he said. Ownership changed hands 3 weeks ago. It now belongs to Walsh Properties, LLC. The words slammed into me like a punch to the chest. My body went cold. That's not possible, I said, my voice sharp with the disbelief. I'm Eleanor Walsh. I'm the legal owner of that property. I've never signed any transfer papers. I understand, ma'am, the clerk replied, glancing down at his screen. But I have the deed right here. It's signed, witnessed, notarized. Everything appears to be in order. My stomach twisted. Another forgery. But unlike the earlier attempt with the power of attorney, this one had succeeded. I felt the bitter sting of betrayal crawl up my spine. When Walter, my longtime banker and the one person I still trusted in that world, finally returned my call, I could already hear the weight in his voice. Mrs. Walsh, I was going to call you today anyway. There's been some troubling activity. I already know, I said, cutting him off gently. The cottage. It's gone. Walter sighed, the sound long and burdened. I was afraid of this. Your son came in last month with what looked like legitimate documents for a property transfer in Maine. Since it wasn't connected to your accounts here and everything seemed properly executed, I didn't question it. You had no reason to, I said for him. I understand. I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Walsh. It's not your fault, I told him, meaning it, but I do need your help again. That afternoon, I found myself in the office of Patricia Winters, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney specializing in elder law. Walter had referred me, assuring me she was the best in the field. As she flipped through my documents and listened intently to my story, a determined expression settled across her face. What they've done is criminal, she said, her voice hard. Forgery, fraud, elder abuse. This isn't just wrong, it's prosecutable. We can fight this. Will it be expensive? I asked, silently calculating the dwindling balance of my retirement savings. Patricia gave me a grim smile. Under normal circumstances, yes, but in this case, I think we'll manage. I have connections at the district attorney's office. Considering the sequence of events, the failed power of attorney followed by the fraudulent property transfer, there's a solid chance they'll be interested in prosecuting. I hesitated. I don't want my son to go to jail, I said, surprising myself as the words left my mouth. After everything James had done, some instinctive maternal part of me still rose up to shield him. Patricia's gaze softened. That's not unusual. Most of my clients in similar situations feel the same way. They want justice, but they still love their children, even when those children have hurt them. I nodded slowly, grateful for her empathy. We have options, she continued. The first step is a cease and desist letter, immediate and forceful. We'll demand that the property be restored to your name and make it clear that failure to comply will bring criminal charges. That evening, I sat on Helen's back deck, a tumbler of whiskey cradled between my palms as the sun slipped below the horizon. The air was colder than the day before, hinting at the winter to come. Helen wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat beside me. What are you thinking? She asked softly. I'm thinking about second chances, I said, and wondering if some wounds ever really heal. Are you doubting this path? She asked gently. Not doubting, I murmured, just seeing things clearly. I've spent so many years pretending, making excuses, imagining a family that loved me, respected me, that would never hurt me. But now, Helen didn't say a word, just waited. Now I know the truth, I said quietly. The family I've been mourning all this time never existed. I wasn't grieving people. I was grieving an illusion. The next morning, my phone rang. The number was familiar. Franklin, my daughter Elsie's husband. Curious, I picked up. Eleanor, he began brusquely, skipping any greeting. This has gone far enough. You need to call off your lawyer. Hello to you too, Franklin, I said, keeping my tone even. I assume this is about the cottage. It's just an old rundown place. You never even go there, he scoffed. James was planning to develop it, make it into something useful. The profits would have helped the whole family. The whole family? I repeated. You mean like the money from the sale of my house that supposedly went toward Elsie's education, but somehow ended up funding your condo? His voice sharpened. That's ancient history. The real issue is your overreaction. This lawsuit could hurt the family's reputation. We don't need a scandal. Ah, there it was. Not concerned for me or even for James really, but for the public fallout. The image of James Walsh, respected businessman and community figure, facing criminal charges. If James returns the property and ceases all attempts to touch my assets, I said clearly, I'll consider letting it go. That's not reasonable, Franklin snapped. There are buyers already lined up. Contracts in progress. There's money tied up in this. Money tied up in something that was stolen from me, I corrected him. This is non-negotiable. Return what belongs to me, or deal with the consequences. When I ended the call, something stirred inside me, strange and new, a bubbling sensation somewhere between laughter and freedom. For 70 years, I had been the one to yield, to keep the peace, to sacrifice. Not anymore. Patricia's legal move worked faster than either of us had expected. Within 48 hours of the cease and desist being delivered, the property listing vanished. 3 days later, her office received official paperwork reversing the fraudulent deed. The cottage was mine again. They blinked, Patricia said, triumphant. They knew they couldn't win this one. I should have felt relieved, triumphant, but instead I felt empty. The property was back in my name, but the final illusion that my family might one day love me, see me, value me, was gone, burned away for good. That evening, I made one final call to Elsie. Grandma, she answered cautiously, are you finally coming home? No, Elsie, I replied gently. I'm calling to say goodbye. There was a pause, then a sharp breath. What do you mean goodbye? I mean that after 70 years of giving my home, my money, my time, my love, and receiving so little in return, I'm finally choosing myself. This is because of the cottage? She asked, incredulous. We apologized. Dad made a mistake. No, I said firmly, cutting her off. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate attempt to steal from me, just like the forged power of attorney. I know what this is, I said, voice quiet but firm. It's a deliberate attempt to take what little I have left, my savings, everything. Grandma, please. I've made up my mind, Elsie. I didn't wait for her to respond. I've already instructed my attorney to revise my will. The cottage, my entire savings, everything I still own, it's all going to the local art center here in Maine. They're starting a scholarship program for young artists who don't have the means to afford professional training. And that's where my legacy will go. A long, weighty silence stretched between us, filled with everything neither of us had the courage to say aloud. At last, her voice came through the line, barely more than a whisper. So that's it? You're just cutting us out? Pretending we never existed? I closed my eyes. Her question didn't catch me off guard, but it struck deeper than I wanted to admit. The ache had been there for years, but now it surfaced, raw and unforgiving. When I finally spoke, my tone didn't waver. It was calm, certain. No, Elsie. You're the one who erased me from your life years ago. I'm not cutting anyone out. I'm just facing the truth you've already written. We said nothing else after that. She hung up, or maybe I did it. I can't remember. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memories, of finality. I put on my jacket and stepped outside, letting the cool coastal air wrap around me. I walked down to the shoreline, where the waves pounded the rocks with a kind of furious grace. The scent of salt mixed with the sharp tang of pine needles, grounding me in the moment. Above, the sky slowly darkened, and the first stars shimmered into view. Distant, constant, untouched by time or hurt. And there, beneath that ancient sky, I smiled. Not the polite, tight-lipped smile I'd worn like armor at Elsie's wedding. Not the hollow one I'd forced through every strained phone call and overlooked birthday. This was different. This one was real. It reached my eyes, stirred something warm in my chest, loosened the knot I'd carried for too long. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't weighed down. I was light. I was free.